Now, Grok 4 is not true AGI yet. It lacks the full autonomy and the generalized reasoning of a human mind, but it is the closest that we have come.
Grok read every prophecy in Revelation, and the timeline it produced left people speechless. That is not the reason most videos give. The timeline it laid out, the Rapture, the Tribulation, the Antichrist, the 1,000-year reign, is not an ancient code the machine cracked. It is a reading invented in the 1830s, and it carries one feature every end times timeline has shared. It has always been wrong about the dates. So where did it really come from? The reading that isn't ancient. It came from a preacher in the 1830s, not from the apostle in the 1st century. The specific sequence Grok laid out, a secret rapture, a 7-year tribulation, a single Antichrist, and a 1,000-year reign, has a name. Scholars call it dispensationalism, and here is what surprises most people about it. It is one of the youngest ways to read Revelation, not the oldest. For most of Christian history, the book was read very differently. For centuries, the typical reader saw Revelation as either a coded account of the church's long struggle through history or as a vision already largely fulfilled in the violence of the 1st century. The idea that it was a secret schedule of future headlines decoded from the news was the exception, not the rule. The timeline feels ancient because it sounds biblical, but the method behind it is surprisingly recent. The reading traces to John Nelson Darby, an Anglo-Irish Bible teacher born in 1800. Through the 1830s, at private study gatherings known as the Powers Court Conferences, Darby worked out a system no one had taught in quite this way before. He divided all of human history into separate ages, which he called dispensations, and argued that the church would be quietly removed from the earth before a final period of catastrophe. That idea, a rapture before the tribulation, had not been the mainstream reading of Revelation for 1800 years. In plain terms, it was brand new. What made it stick was not a sermon. It was a book. In 1909, an American minister named Cyrus Scofield published a reference Bible that placed Darby's interpretive notes directly beneath the scripture, printed on the same page as the text itself. For generations of ordinary readers, those footnotes looked like part of the Bible. The Scofield Reference Bible spread dispensationalism through American churches more effectively than any preacher could have until the Rapture timeline stopped feeling like one possible interpretation and started feeling like the obvious meaning of the passage. Two later waves locked it deeper into the culture. Hal Lindsey's 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, argued that biblical prophecy was lining up with Cold War headlines, becoming one of the best-selling non-fiction titles of the decade. Decades later, the Left Behind novels turned the same timeline into fiction that sold tens of millions of copies. By the time Grok ever read a single verse of Revelation, this reading was not one option among many sitting in the machine's training data. It was the dominant one. So when Grok produced a Rapture to Millennium timeline, it was not decoding a 2,000-year-old prophecy. It was echoing a reading roughly 190 years old, polished by a 1909 study Bible and a 1970 paperback. And it is not the only reading on offer. There are at least 3 others, each building a completely different timeline. So why does the machine settle on just one? 4 books, 1 timeline machine. It settles on one because that is what it was fed. Grok is a large language model built by Elon Musk's company xAI, and like every model of its kind, it generates answers by predicting patterns from the text it was trained on. When the training data is mostly English language, American, and evangelical, the single timeline it returns is the one that dominates that world. But that is not the only timeline the book has ever produced. The model has no theology and no denomination of its own. It simply mirrors, in compressed form, the books, sermons, websites, and novels it was fed. And in the English-speaking world, those happen to skew heavily toward one school of thought. So the timeline that came back tells you less about Revelation itself than about which books about Revelation are loudest right now. For 2,000 years, scholars have read the book through 4 very different lenses, and each lens builds a different map of the future. The first is the preterist view, which reads most of Revelation as history that already happened, centered on the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 and the Roman Empire that crushed them. To a preterist, the terrifying beasts are ancient Rome. The second is the historicist view, which treats the book as a running forecast of church history from the apostles to the present, with the medieval papacy often cast as the Antichrist. The third is the idealist view, which throws out the calendar entirely and reads the symbols as the timeless struggle between good and evil repeating in every generation. So if 4 trained readers can look at the same text and draw 4 different timelines, what exactly does it mean? That a machine handed back just one? It means the machine did what machines do. It averaged its inputs. The futurist reading, the one Darby built, is the loudest voice in the data, so the futurist timeline is what came out. Scholars like G.K. Beale, whose commentary on Revelation is a standard reference, and David Ahn, who wrote a major academic commentary on the book, spend hundreds of pages explaining why these readings compete rather than agree. Among scholars who study this professionally, the futurist reading is less dominant than in popular culture. But popular culture is what fills a language model's training set. No algorithm votes between these interpretations. The machine simply reflects which reading is loudest, and that happens to be the youngest. So the timeline that left people speechless was a popularity contest decided long before anyone asked. But before we argue over which lens is correct, there is a more basic clue the whole timeline race tends to bury. The very first readers had a specific person in mind for the beast, and it was not a figure in the distant future. So who was the man they were already afraid of? The beast had a name. The man they were afraid of was Nero. To the first Christians reading Revelation, the beast with the number 666 was not a shadowy future tyrant. It was the emperor who had already begun hunting their communities. The book was written to people living under that threat, and its symbols were aimed at a target they recognized on sight. The history behind that fear is concrete. Nero blamed the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 on the Christians, and the Roman historian Tacitus recorded that they were rounded up and executed in the arena, crucified, and burned as a public spectacle. For the original audience of Revelation, the beast was not a riddle about the distant future. It was a description of the man signing their death warrants. Start with the math. In the ancient world, Hebrew and Greek letters did double duty as numbers, a system called gematria, where each letter of the alphabet also stood for a specific value. Revelation ends its description of the beast with a riddle, telling readers to calculate its number 666. Spell the title Nero Caesar in Hebrew letters, and the values add up to exactly 666. The first readers did not need to guess. They could do the arithmetic themselves, and the answer required no special revelation, only a pencil. There is a detail that makes this reading even harder to dismiss. Some of the earliest copies of the text do not say 666 at all. They say 616. That lower number is what you get if you spell the name the way it was pronounced in Latin, without the final letter. 2 different spellings, 2 different numbers, both pointing at the same emperor. That is not the fingerprint of a vague future villain. It is the fingerprint of a specific man in a specific empire at a specific moment. The reading is not fringe. It appears in standard reference works, and it traces back to the early church, including Irenaeus, who wrote about the number around the year 180. Serious scholars still debate it, and not everyone agrees the beast is Nero. Some read the number symbolically, as a parody of divine perfection, falling short of 7 the way humanity falls short of God. But the point holds either way. The book's first audience had concrete, contemporary villains in mind, not an abstract end-times calendar waiting to be matched to cable news. If the beast had a name and a date in the 1st century, that raises an uncomfortable question for everyone who came after. Because once you decide Revelation is really about your own era, the temptation to attach a year becomes almost irresistible. And for the last 200 years, generation after generation has given in to that temptation. So what happened every single time someone turned this book into a calendar? The perfect record. Every single time, they were wrong. The history of dating the end from Revelation is not a story of near misses. It is a flawless record of failure, and it stretches back nearly 2 centuries. Each generation produced its own teacher, its own math, its own certain date, and every one of those dates passed like any other ordinary Tuesday. The most famous early case came in 1844. An American preacher named William Miller had calculated from scripture that Christ would return, first between March of 1843 and March of 1844, and then, after that window closed, on October 22, 1844, tens of thousands of believers gathered, waited, and watched the sun go down on nothing. Some had given away their property and were left ruined. They gave the day a name that stuck. They called it the Great Disappointment, and the movement eventually reshaped itself into new denominations that carried on without the failed date. The pattern only sharpened with time. In 1988, a former NASA engineer named Edgar Wisnant published a booklet titled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988, pinpointing the event for the Jewish New Year that September. It sold roughly 4.5 million copies, and another 300,000 were mailed free to pastors across America. When September passed, he simply moved the date to 1989, then 1993, then 1994. The books stopped selling, and the rapture never arrived. Nor was this an American quirk. The Jehovah's Witnesses set dates for the end in 1914, 1925, and 1975, and quietly revised them each time nothing happened. A widely circulated catalog of predicted doomsday dates now runs to roughly 200 separate entries. In 2011, the radio preacher Harold Camping spent an estimated $100 million warning that Judgment Day would arrive on May 21st. It did not, and he later pushed the date to October. With a track record like that, what would it actually take to trust the next date someone pulls from these pages? The strangest part is that the loudest voice against all this date setting is the text itself. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says plainly that about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but only the Father. And yet the dates keep coming, and now they come from a machine. The difference this time is that the predictor is wrapped in the language of data and probability, which makes it feel more authoritative than a preacher with a chalkboard. But underneath the new packaging, the old problem is unchanged. Grok is still reading an ancient, contested text and pressing it onto the present. So what is the machine actually doing when it builds this timeline? And why can no amount of computing power settle a question that has stayed open for 2,000 years? Why the machine can't settle it? What the machine is doing is not interpretation. It is pattern recognition at enormous speed, which is a very different thing. Grok, like any large language model, learns the statistical relationships between words across billions of pages of text. Ask it about Revelation, and it assembles the most probable response from everything humans have ever written about Revelation. That is genuinely powerful. But probability is not the same as truth, and spotting a pattern is not the same as knowing what the pattern means. This is the weakness every honest analyst flags. If you feed a system only the data points that support a specific conclusion, the system will find support for that conclusion every time. The stronger the pattern you went looking for, the more surely you will find it staring back at you. One critic of the genre put it precisely. He said, "This is not prophecy being confirmed. It is confirmation bias, automated. The machine has no way to tell whether a match between an ancient symbol and a modern headline is genuinely meaningful, or whether the person asking simply selected only the matches that fit and ignored the rest. There is a deeper reason no computer can settle this, and it has nothing to do with processing power. The disagreement over Revelation is not a math problem waiting for a faster chip. It is a dispute about how to read an ancient, deliberately symbolic text written in a genre, apocalyptic literature, that was never meant to be read like a newspaper. A faster computer reads the text faster. It does not decide whether the text is meant literally or symbolically, because that decision is made before the reading even begins, by the reader. You cannot compute your way past a disagreement that lives in the assumptions, not in the data. Two equally educated people can apply two equally valid methods and land on two completely different futures. No amount of computation chooses between hermeneutics. Even Grok, asked directly, tends to hedge. Pushed on whether its timeline is an actual prediction, it falls back on the same caution any careful scholar would use, noting that the book has been read many ways and that certainty is not possible. The machine understands its own limit better than some of the people now quoting it. So the timeline that went viral is not a forecast that happened to come from a computer. It is a reflection, bounced back from the loudest reading in the data, of a question humans have been asking for 2,000 years. And that reflection points to the most interesting part of the whole story. Because if every generation sees its own world mirrored in this book, the real mystery is not what Revelation predicts about our era. So why is this ancient text so uncannily good at reflecting whichever era happens to be reading it? The mirror, not the map. It is so good at it because it was built to be. Revelation belongs to a genre called apocalyptic literature, and that genre was designed to do exactly this, to speak to people living under pressure by dressing the conflicts of their own moment in cosmic imagery. The book was first read by small, frightened Christian communities scattered across the Roman Empire, people who needed to hear that the empire crushing them was already defeated in the eyes of heaven. The symbols were vivid precisely because they were meant to be recognizable in every age to anyone who felt the world turning against them. That is why the match always feels so exact. Medieval Christians saw the Black Death in the Pale Horse and the plagues. During the World Wars, preachers found the beast in the Kaiser, then in Hitler and Mussolini. Cold War Americans saw the Soviet Union in the northern invader of Ezekiel and the Red Horse of War. Every century finds its own empire, its own pestilence, its own beast, because the imagery is drawn wide enough to fit whatever is terrifying the reader at the time. The convergence Grok noticed between the text and the present is real. It is just not unique. It has been real in every generation that has ever opened the book. The nation of Israel existing, Jerusalem contested, great powers clashing over the Middle East. All of it lines up with the futurist reading, and all of it is genuinely happening right now. But pause on the logic for a second. If a text was constructed to mirror the anxieties of every age, is the fact that it mirrors our age evidence of prophecy, or is it evidence of a very well-made mirror? This is the speechless part, just not the one the clickbait promised. The astonishing thing is not that a machine found a timeline in Revelation. It is that the machine held up a mirror to a 190-year-old reading inside a 2,000-year-old book, and people saw their own moments staring back at them. That will keep happening, with or without AI, because the book was engineered to make it happen, and every age supplies fresh fears to feed it. None of this strips the book of its power. If anything, it explains why that power has lasted 2 full millennia. Revelation endures precisely because it refuses to sit still as a single timeline, and it speaks anew to every generation that reads it under pressure, including ours. The book was not written to end arguments. It was written to give hope to people who thought they were losing. So when Grok read every prophecy in Revelation, the timeline really did leave people speechless, not because it cracked the future. The timeline is a 190-year-old reading with a flawless record on dates, echoed by a machine that mirrors our fears but cannot settle a 2,000-year argument. Is Revelation prophecy, or the most enduring mirror we ever built? Could any machine prove which?